Gucci Mane is one of the most influential rappers to ever come out of Atlanta. But there's also another side to Gucci's career that doesn't get talked about nearly as much. Because while Gucci has built a reputation for discovering rappers like Pooh Shiesty, Big Scarr, Enchanting, and others, 1017 has also developed a reputation for artists disappearing from the label almost as quickly as they appeared. Waka Flocka Flame, OG the Juiceman, Asian Dog, Young Scooter, and eventually almost the entire modern 1017 roster. So what actually happened? Is 1017 really a shady record label? Could we really blame Pooh Shiesty for his actions a couple months ago? Or is Gucci Mane simply a rapper who has repeatedly struggled with the business side of running a label? And perhaps most importantly, why do so many artists seem to have trouble maintaining a long-term relationship with 1017? To answer that, we'll have to go back to the beginning. Let's get it. In 2007, Gucci Mane began building what would eventually become 1017 Records. By 2010, Gucci officially launched 1017 Brit Squad Records with himself as president and CEO. The label's early roster included Gucci himself, Waka Flocka Flame, and OG the Juiceman, and at first, everything seemed to be working. Gucci was becoming one of the biggest names in Southern hip-hop, Waka Flocka was preparing to become a superstar, and OG the Juiceman had already pretty much developed a serious following. But behind the scenes, the business relationship weren't nearly as stable as the music made them look. Gucci himself described 1017 as a label where he handled much of the day-to-day business. And in a 2013 interview with Fader, Gucci said Waka was signed to 1017 while also discussing Waka's separate Brit Squad monopoly operation. That distinction would become extremely important because eventually the two sides would completely fall apart. Waka Flocka wasn't just another artist on 1017, he was arguably Gucci's biggest early success story. But in 2013, Gucci tweeted that he had dropped Waka Flocka from Brit Squad, but Waka pushed back. And here's where things kind of get interesting, because Waka publicly claimed that Gucci couldn't simply kick him out because he owned a stake in 1017 Brit Squad and Brit Squad Monopoly. Gucci's side disputed aspects of the situation and the relationship deteriorated badly. Eventually, Waka told MTV that he and Gucci would never make music or do business together again. And this wasn't simply an artist agreement. It was a business dispute involving ownership and contractual relationships. And that distinction matters, because if you're an aspiring rapper watching this unfold, there is an obvious question. Who actually owns what? And perhaps more importantly, who controls your career once you sign? Here's where the story gets even more complicated, because in 2013, Gucci Mane sued people associated with his former business operation, including Waka Flocka's mother and manager, Deborah Anthony. Gucci alleged that his business interests had been taken over without his permission. He also alleged that royalties were being withheld and that label expenses had been inflated. Those were Gucci's allegations in a lawsuit, not findings that everyone involved had been proven guilty of. But there's an important irony here. Gucci was publicly portraying himself as someone who had been screwed over in the business side of the music industry, while his own label relationships were simultaneously falling apart. And this would become a recurring theme around 1017. OJ the Juiceman is one of the most interesting examples. He wasn't just some random rapper Gucci discovered on Instagram. OJ and Gucci had known each other since childhood. They grew up together in Atlanta and eventually started making music together. OJ even helped establish the Brit Squad identity. Gucci himself said in a Fadar interview that OJ came up with the name Brit Squad. But despite being one of the original people around the movement, OJ's career eventually moved away from the center of Gucci's operation. And this is where we need to be careful. There's no solid evidence proving that Gucci intentionally sabotaged OJ's career, but there is evidence of a broader pattern. Artists who helped build the 1017 Brit Squad ecosystem didn't necessarily remain central to it. A later examination of 1017's history described OJ's business relationship with Gucci as eventually framed, while his career became increasingly separated from the label. That's not proof of wrongdoing, but it's certainly a power worth examining. Then Gucci reinvented 1017. The new 1017 emerged with a new generation of artists. Pooh Shiesty, Foogiano, however you say it, Big Scarr, Enchanting, Big Walk Dog, Hot Boy West, Big Fizzle, and others. In 2021, Atlantic described the 1017 roster as a super team and promoted the label's compilation projects featuring these artists. And for a while, it looked like Gucci had finally figured out. Pooh Shiesty he exploded. Back in Blood became a massive hit. Big Scarr built a serious following. Foogiano had a major Gucci cosign. Enchanting developed her own sound. The machine was working, but then the problems once again started. Asian Doll became the first woman signed to 1017, and initially she was extremely excited about it. In interviews, she talked about Gucci as a role model and described the situation positively. She even described joining the label as finally having a home and a family, but eventually Asian Doll left. And this is another important distinction. There isn't credible evidence establishing that Gucci committed some specific financial crime against Asian Doll. What we do have is a successful artist entering the label with enormous expectations and eventually separated from it. That's significant because Asian Doll wasn't an isolated case. It was becoming part of a much larger pattern. And then there was Big Scarr. Scarr signed to 1017 in 2020, and his debut mixtape, The Big Grim Reaper, reached number 25 on the Billboard Top 200. He was one of the label's most promising young artists, but his career was tragically cut short when he died on December 22, just at 22 years old. And this is where the internet discussions about 1017 can become irresponsible. There are plenty of theories online about Gucci, Scarr, his contract money, and what happened behind the scenes, but theories aren't evidence. There is not enough reliable evidence to claim that Gucci caused Scarr's problem or death, and we shouldn't pretend otherwise. What we can say is that Scarr's death represented another devastating blow to a label whose young roster had already experienced serious instability. Then we had Enchanting. She joined 1017 and appeared on projects like So Icy Summer and other label compilations. Her official biography even describes Gucci calling her shortly after hearing about her music. But Enchanting's story ended tragically. She died in June 2024 at just 26 years old. Gucci publicly mourned her, and Atlantic also released a statement following her death. Again, there's no credible basis for blaming Gucci or 1017 for her death, but her story demonstrates something important about the environment surrounding the label. These weren't just business transactions. Gucci was signing extremely young artists whose careers, finances, personal lives, and futures were becoming tied to an increasingly unstable ecosystem. And that brings us to the biggest piece of evidence. October 2024, Gucci Mane announced that he was releasing almost every artist from 1017 roster. He reportedly decided to let the artists take their talents elsewhere rather than keeping them under contract. And who did he keep? Pooh Shiesty and Foogiano. That's an enormous change because just a few years earlier, Gucci had presented 1017 as a growing super team. Now most of the roster was pretty much gone. Hip Hop DX reported that Gucci said he could have kept the artist under contract, but chose what he characterized as an unselfish decision to let him leave. On one hand, you could look at this as Gucci doing the right thing. If the label wasn't actively developing these artists, releasing them could actually be the most ethical decision. But there's another way to look at it. Why did so many artists need to be released in the first place? Now this is where the story becomes more interesting. Just look at the pattern. The artists get signed, they receive the Gucci Mane cosign, they appear on 1017 compilations, they build momentum, then in many cases the relationship can eventually end. Sometimes the artists leave, they get dropped, sometimes the situation becomes a public dispute, and sometimes the artist simply disappears from the 1017 spotlight. This doesn't automatically mean Gucci is shady. Record labels, they're complicated. Artists don't always succeed, contracts expire, people fall out, executives make mistakes, and artists themselves can create the problems. But if you're trying to evaluate 1017 objectively, the repeated turnover is impossible to ignore. And then in 2026, the relationship between Gucci Mane and Pooh Shiesty took an insane turn. This time, the allegations weren't that Gucci was mistreating his artists. They went in the opposite direction. Federal prosecutors allege that in January 2026, Pooh Shiesty and several others arranged a meeting in Dallas concerning his recording contract with 1017. According to the prosecutors, an armed confrontation followed. Authorities allege that Shiesty forced one of the victims to sign a document releasing him from the recorded contract. And prosecutors also allege that valuable jewelry, watches, cash, and other property was also taken. Gucci Mane has been widely identified as one of the alleged victims, although the Justice Department announcement used initials rather than naming him. And in July 2026, prosecutors reportedly submitted surveillance and other evidence in the case, including the video that they say shows Shiesty pressuring the 1017 owner, Gucci Mane, to sign the release. Now, obviously, this is an allegation and a criminal case, not a conviction, but it's video evidence, so you kind of could. But if the prosecution account is accurate, the irony is almost unbelievable. After years of people questioning how Gucci handled his artists, one of his own artists allegedly went to extraordinary lengths to get away from the label. And I'm not condoning Pooh Shiesty actions at all. I'm not condoning no violence, and even if you have a disagreement with anybody or any boss or whatever, that's not the way to go about things. But you have to take a look from Shiesty's point of view. Gucci Mane, matter of fact, Pooh Shiesty, when he got out of prison, he released FDO, and that was the #1 hit for a couple of weeks. Reportedly, Gucci Mane made $600K from that song, and Pooh Shiesty, Pooh Shiesty's song, he only took home $73,000 from that song. So then when you look at stuff like that, you can't really blame Pooh Shiesty. Well, you can blame him, but you can't really blame him from being mad and wanting to be released from the label when you see stuff like that. There's no way Pooh Shiesty's #1 hit, Pooh Shiesty has a #1 hit, and Gucci Mane is taking $600K of that one. He only gets 73. So I understand why Pooh Shiesty was mad. He wanted to be dropped, but it kind of makes you think that, is Gucci doing this? Was he doing this to his other artists, which is why they left and why it was so many falling outs? Who knows? Now here's the part where we have to separate the facts from internet narratives. Is there proof that Gucci Mane has systematically cheated every artist who signed to 1017? No. Is there proof that every artist who left 1017 was mistreated? No. Is there proof that Gucci intentionally sabotaged artists like Big Scarr or Enchanting? No. Those claims go beyond the available evidence. But is there a documented history of messy business relationships? Yes. Waka Flocka publicly disputed his relationship with Gucci and claimed ownership in the company. Gucci himself filed a lawsuit involving allegations over control of his business and royalty. OJ the Juiceman, an original member of the movement, eventually separated from the core 1017 operation. Asian Doll joined with enormous enthusiasm and later left. The new 1017 roster was eventually almost completely cleared out. And now in 2026, the label is at the center of extraordinary legal dispute involving one of the biggest former stars. Those are facts that can be documented. Calling all that proof that Gucci is a scammer, that's a conclusion the evidence don't fully support. But calling 1017's history messy, that's much harder to argue against. You know what I'm saying? It's just look at the facts, look at the roller coaster of events that happened within the label. Gucci Mane deserves enormous credit for what he has done for hip-hop, Atlanta hip-hop. He has given opportunities to artists who might have never received a major label look. He helped launch Waka Flocka, he helped bring Pooh Shiesty to a massive audience, he signed Big Scarr, he gave Enchanting a platform, and his influence on trap music is undeniable. But running a record label isn't the same thing as discovering talent. A great A&R can find an artist. A great businessman knows how to build the infrastructure around them. And that's where 1017's history becomes difficult to ignore. Because after almost 2 decades, the label has produced some incredible artists, but very few stable long-term 1017 careers. And that, maybe that's the real lesson. The Gucci Mane cosign can get you through the door, but getting through the door and actually building a career inside the house are two completely different things. And as the latest legal battle involving Pooh Shiesty demonstrates, the business relationship behind the 1017 logo may, be just as complicated as the music itself. But that's all for me. What do y'all think? Is 1017 simply a label with an unusually high artist turnover, or is there something deeper going on behind the scenes? Let me know in the comments. I'm down to argue with y'all. Like, comment, subscribe. Don't go nowhere. Click the video on the screen. I made a video on CJ So Cool. The video did very good, but I noticed that 98% of y'all wasn't subscribed while watching the video. I mean, you're watching people you don't subscribe to. Like, lock in, subscribe, man. Like the video. Follow me on IG in the bottom of the description, and let's get it, man.